people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Francisco A. Salazar. His sources. Adrian Broner will be facing Omar Figueroa in a welterweight fight on July 23rd in Chicago on a PBC on Fox card. Broner last fought on February 20th of last year, defeating Alexis Santiago. Figueroa lost to Abel Ramos in May of last year. In that way, the both of these fighters have not seen action in the last 12 months, in a year's time.
It's a crossroads fight.
Loser's gotta leave town kind of situation. Loser's gotta leave town kind of fight. I think what's most surprising about this situation is that this ain't happening.
This is a PBC on Fox show.
This isn't happening on the Stefan Espinoza Showtime side of things. Most boxing insiders speculate that this could very well be Fox's last year in the sport of boxing, and they may choose not to renew their deal with the PBC. They chose to extend the deal
A fourth year.
I think that's what caught me by surprise the most when it comes to this story. There were talks of Adrian Broner entertaining offers from Matchroom for a potential Conor Benn fight, but those talks, they fizzled out a long time ago. I was never expecting Adrian Broner to cross over to the Matchroom DAZN side of things.
And dusting off Omar Figueroa, too.
Omar is coming off of 2 back-to-back losses. The loss he suffered way back when in 2019 to Yordenis Ugas.
He suffers that loss, he sits out all of 2020, doesn't have a fight.
Comes back in May of last year and drops a decision to Abel Ramos.
There's over a year's time in between each one of these losses.
And call me crazy, but perhaps sitting out for an entire year after a fight, perhaps that's not a good idea, because there's a year's time in between each one of these losses that Omar suffered, and I don't think that's conducive towards keeping him sharp. I think keeping him active.
Hey, don't jump to conclusions. Maybe he don't want to be active.
Maybe Adrian don't either. He's been crying broke for the longest time, urging Al Heyman to give him his money, whatever the hell he means by that. Entertaining offers from Matchroom and DAZN, though not biting, not actually taking Matchroom up on those offers. And I wonder, what's he going to get paid for fighting Omar Figueroa that he wouldn't have gotten paid fighting Conor Benn?
I'd wager Broner versus Benn in the UK generates more excitement than this.
In terms of a fan reaction and fan involvement, I don't know very many people here in the United States that are excited about Omar Figueroa's career, or Adrian Broner's for that matter.
You guys excited about this fight?
This is a crossroads fight, and I'd wager that in many circles this is viewed as a fight between journeymen, 2 guys whose best days really are behind them. Whatever they were going to do in the sport of boxing, they must have done it already.
Supposed to be going down on the 23rd of next month.
Loser's got to leave town in the winter. I assume that the winner might fight, I don't know, Keith Thurman?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe this is a prelude to something bigger, one last hurrah for the winner?
A career that continues to circle the drain for the loser.
If fattening the both of these guys up for somebody, that inference you can make.
And Keith Thurman is the only guy without a dance partner.
Yeah, Danny Garcia, he's left the welterweight division. His next fight is a junior middleweight contest with Jose Benavidez. Meanwhile, Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., they're supposed to be settling up with each other later on this year.
Eddie says he wants to get Keith Thurman in the ring with Conor Benn.
And he'll end up having about as much luck with Keith as he had with Adrian Broner, as he had very recently with Jose Ramirez.
Just saying, he said he wants to get Keith Thurman in the ring with Conor Benn.
Well, want doesn't always get, especially when it comes to PBC fighters and making fights with them. How many offers have gone out from Matchroom to PBC fighters like Jermall Charlo and Gervonta Davis, Keith Thurman, Adam Kovnowski, who very recently rejected an offer to take on Derek Chisora, a 7-figure offer.
Those guys ain't gonna cross the street, man.
My honest opinion is they're fattening up the winner of this fight so that they can eventually take on Keith Thurman on either the Fox or Showtime side of things. Finally, the ongoing situation in the Southern Hemisphere as Devin Haney's father, trainer Bill Haney, is set to arrive in Australia in time to be in his son's corner for the George Kambosos Jr. fight after being granted a last-minute visa to enter into the country, according to Top Rank.
The stars have aligned.
There was just so much drama in association with Devin Haney's corner situation ahead of this weekend's big undisputed lightweight.
We already knew that they were making things hard for Devin's father.
And I heard something in reference to Devin's cut man not being allowed to enter into the country either. I mean, it just felt like they were chipping away at Devin's corner situation, the stability in his corner.
I had hoped the Australian government would come around, and they did.
So now it's time to get down to brass tacks. Will the presence of Bill Haney make a difference? Does it even come down to Bill being there or not being there?
Who's going to win this fight?
I've wrestled with this off and on ever since the fight was announced. George Kambosos Jr. arriving and proving that he is not to be trifled with, not to be underestimated. The home field advantage that he
I
has.
said it before and I'll say it again. This is a guy who was willing to fight Vasil Lomachenko.
In a fight that I gave George very little odds of winning. If it were Vasil Lomachenko that George were fighting tomorrow in Australia, I'd have no doubts that Vasil Lomachenko would leave with George's belts. But as it stands, Vasil Lomachenko is all caught up in the crisis over there in the Ukraine, and Devin Haney did what he had to do to stand in his place, made the necessary concessions.
He made sacrifices to get this opportunity. Big ones.
You want my honest opinion? Both boys like their chances. Both boys.
They're both confident. George Kambosos was willing to fight Vasil Lomachenko, so why would he sweat Devin Haney?
He wouldn't. And Devin Haney, you see what he had to do, what he had to agree to in order to get George Kambosos Jr. in the ring, and all the drama in association with the match.
Devin Haney likes his chances. He wouldn't have boarded that plane if he didn't, without his father.
At minimum, you have to say that Devin Haney must really like his chances. At minimum, what you have to say is that both boys, they are confident in their abilities. They'll ultimately, it's boxing, the boxing itself, the nuts and bolts of it, that are going to determine tomorrow's winner. And I happen to think
What say you?
the better boxer is Devin Haney. Try and understand that George Kambosos very much shocked the world against Teofimo Lopez. He did. But Teofimo gave him the opportunity to do that. Things having drug on as long as they did. The physical condition of Teofimo Lopez and how Teofimo chose to fight the fight. Going out there looking for a home run.
Loading up on all his shots, looking for a knockout.
Fighting like a madman. He left himself open to be countered. I don't think for a second that's the kind of fight that Devin Haney is going to fight tomorrow night. Now, Devin Haney is, in fact, a more cerebral fighter than Teofimo Lopez.
He's more defensively responsible than Teofimo Lopez.
Whatever George did to Teofimo has absolutely nothing to do with what he can do to Devin. They're different fighters and styles, after all. They do make fights. Devin Haney will not afford George the same opportunities.
Devin's going to keep it long and loose and use the jab.
Slow George down and keep him on the outside at arm's length. For those not aware, Devin Haney is, in fact, the taller, longer fighter.
I see Devin Haney alternating the speed of that jab and taking a half step back whenever George gets around it.
George is no slouch. George is capable. George is fast. He's got speed of his own. But he is the smaller guy in this thing. He's got to get mid-range to inside before he can do anything. And Devin Haney, he is fleet of foot.
He takes a half step and he's out of range of George's punches.
Gets back on his jab and can make things very frustrating for George Kambosos Jr. Make things difficult. Make it hard for George to get mid-range to inside to start landing hard shots. For what it's worth, I happen to think that George Kambosos is the more durable fighter.
Just being honest, I don't think Devin's got the best punch resistance.
Gotta give George credit. He got dropped by Teofimo Lopez, a bigger puncher than Devin Haney. He got dropped by Teofimo late in their fight, and he picked himself up off the canvas, withstood the storm, weathered the shot, and got back in the fight. If Teofimo couldn't knock this guy out...
You have to say he's durable. If Teofimo couldn't knock him out, George has got some beer.
You often hear it said that the jab is the most important punch in boxing, and I think tomorrow's fight is going to be an example of this. I feel like Devin Haney has more variations of the jab. uses it in different ways.
Wasn't Teofimo, because Teofimo's a knockout puncher. You know what he's trying to set up.
Setting you up to knock you out, whereas Devin Haney, in spite of not being a big puncher, a knockout puncher, he does show a bit more variety. More importantly, he's a more cerebral fighter. He's not fighting on emotion.
Teofimo was trying to go home early.
Devin's not missed the big in the britches, distracted by this and that, ahead of his fight with George, the same way that Teofimo was with George. I think that Devin, for the most part, he's got his head on straight, and now that his father has been allowed into the country,
That's an instant morale boost.
that it happened at such a tumultuous time in Devin's corner ahead of this fight that things were looking somber for a while there, and in the 13th hour, a ray of light, a ray of hope.
I'm going with Devin Haney to win on points.
I think Devin can keep a lid on the situation with the lead hand, slow the fight down, limit George's opportunities to land big shots by being responsible.
It doesn't always make for the most crowd-pleasing fights, the most entertaining fights.
I think Devin is going to keep this a boxing match, and in that arena, I think he can secure a unanimous decision.
I know that many of you out there are going with George Kambosos to win the fight.
And there is reason enough to do so. There's a credible argument on both sides of the aisle.
But I don't think tomorrow's fight between Devin and George is going to look like last year's fight with Teofimo and George.
A guy who's committing to his shots and looking for a knockout, home run swing, he's easier to counter than a guy who's taking his time and picking his punches, picking away at his opponent.
I'm going with Devin Haney on points.
Along with the main event,
There are a number of fights on that same card I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
when it comes to the super flyweight contest between Taylor Robertson and Sarah Higginson, I am going with Taylor Robertson to win on points. Taylor, she's not a big puncher per se, but she is a slickster, defensively responsible, young, and
A
fast.
pot shotter who picks her punches from a safe distance.
There's really no footage available of Sarah Higginson in action, so that makes this prediction a bit hard to stand by, but given what I've seen from Taylor,
The fact she was able to go the distance with Shannon O'Connell upstairs at bantamweight.
I'd say she can outpoint Sarah Higginson in a 5-rounder at super flyweight. There is also the Jason Molony versus Ashton Palicte fight.
Ashton Palicte, who after having been knocked out by Kazuto Ioka at super flyweight, decided to venture north.
Up to bantamweight. He lost another fight after losing to Kazuto Ioka to Renz Rosia in the bantamweight division, but he's gotten himself back in the winner's bracket, and he's amassed 3 pro victories ever since.
Yeah, against pedestrian-level opponents.
Do I think he'll be able to secure another against Jason Molony?
No.
Jason Molony, who was in action in August of last year against the very capable Joshua Greer. He won in good fashion against that guy, won a decision. More recently, in March of this year, he was in action against Francisco Portillo, and I think
The winner of this fight becomes the mandatory challenger for the WBO title at 118 pounds.
mandatory challenger for Paul Butler's brown belt. Newly crowned WBO bantamweight champion Paul Butler, who was elevated to full championship status after John Real Casimiro screwed the pooch in that entire sordid affair we don't have time to talk about here. In any event, I'm going with Jason Molony to win on points tomorrow.
And I'm going with Junior Fa to splatter Lucas Brown.
Well, I know that Junior Fa is still coming off that loss to Joseph Parker in February of last year, and that it's been well over a year since Junior Fa had a fight, but I also know that Lucas Brown is getting long in the tooth. That Lucas Brown is a guy who was knocked out by Paul Gallen.
Galen.
Whatever it is, Paul is a guy who crossed over from rugby into boxing. I mean, you talk about your late
That
starters.
guy knocked out Lucas Brown in 1 round last year.
And I get the sense that Lucas Brown is a shot fighter. I get the sense that as soon as Junior Fa lands something of some substance, he's going to take Lucas Brown out. So my prediction is Junior Fa by way of knockout. Finally, the fight between Devin Haney and George Kambosos Jr. isn't the only title fight set to go down tomorrow. On Showtime, in the men's super bantamweight division, reigning unified champion of Philadelphia, Stefan Fulton, will defend his WBC and WBO titles against former unified champion Daniel Roman.
Stefan Fulton had a big year last year.
He saw himself become a full-fledged world champion and a unified champion, all inside of 12 months. 12 months, that's right. Last year, he took on unbeaten Angelo Leo and wrestled away his WBO title. He moved on from that fight and took on unbeaten Brendan Figueroa, pried the green belt away from him.
Stefan had a big year last year.
Daniel Roman didn't. Daniel Roman, the former unified champion, he only had one fight, just one fight in May of last year, and in that way, it has been...
It's been a year since this guy had a fight.
At any given moment, you could spit in the wind and hit a PBC fighter that hasn't fought in the last 12 months. You really could.
And I've had my mind made up about this fight for a while now.
And what made up my mind about this fight, oddly enough, is a fight where Stephen Fulton didn't look his best. His last fight with Brandon Figueroa. He looked flustered by the very statuesque and physically imposing Brandon Figueroa. But what I took away from that fight is that, your average super bantamweight doesn't tower over guys the same way that Brandon Figueroa does. That Brandon Figueroa is arguably the most, if not one of the most physically imposing fighters in that entire weight class, in that entire division. And if Stephen Fulton can take Brandon Figueroa's best, I'm sure he can take Daniel's best, especially off a year-long layoff.
Because Daniel's not a big puncher anyway.
Oh, yeah, Daniel Roman's a busy puncher, a prolific one, an active puncher, volume guy.
But he's not a big puncher. He's not a one-hitter-quitter kind of guy.
The aesthetic of that Brandon Figueroa-Stephen Fulton fight left a lasting impression on me because it showed me that Stephen Fulton, while he didn't look his best in that Figueroa fight, he was durable enough to hang in there, get off some hard shots of his own. And if he can do that with Brandon, mid-range to inside, deep in the pocket, as Brandon tried to muscle him around, if he can do that with Brandon, he can do it with Daniel, because Daniel's a mid-range to inside fighter as well, just a smaller one. And
the less active one. He hasn't fought in 12 months.
I'm expecting a mid-range to inside fight like what we saw in the Angelo Leo fight, the Brandon Figueroa fight.
But because Stephen Fulton's seen action more recently than Daniel,
I'm expecting him to be sharper than Daniel Roman. I'm expecting all the eye-catching shots, the photo-finish punches, to come from Stephen Fulton as opposed to Daniel Roman, who's going to be busy.
But not busy enough. I think Stephen Fulton can win on points.
In a tight fight where both boys are going to be throwing a lot of leather. It's going to be hard to separate them at times, and I think what's going to make all the difference are eye-catching shots.
And, Stephen Fulton, he is the somewhat longer guy.
A little bit more height, a little bit more reach, a few years younger than Daniel Roman, and certainly more active in the last 12 months.
Yeah, I'm going with Stephen Fulton to win on points, I am.
And I don't quite hear Stephen Fulton beating the drum as loud as he was some months ago to become this division's undisputed champion and unify titles with MJ Akhmadaliev. I don't hear Stephen Fulton beating that drum anymore, and I get the sense that...
I told you all not to hold your breath.
I told you. MJ's over there on the Matchroom and DAZN side of things, and Stephen, he's over there on PBC Island, so unless something changes, that fight's not going to happen.
This upcoming weekend's fight with Daniel Roman, this title defense, I should say.
It's not a segue to that fight. It's not a prelude. The super bantamweight division may not be able to cut through the bureaucratic red tape and the proverbial politics of boxing that prevent certain fights from happening, like this one, the undisputed title fight between Stephen Fulton, if he wins tomorrow, and MJ Akhmadaliev. Unfortunately.
Not unless something changes and somebody ends up on somebody else's side of the street. I don't see that happening.